One steel tube with 70 men, a diesel throb, cold lockers stacked with food, and air conditioning to keep minds clear in tropical heat. The Gato and Balao-class fleet boats were built for this, about 11,000 nautical miles of range at 10 knots, 24 torpedoes in the racks, a 5-inch deck gun, 40mm Bofors, and radar that could paint targets at night. Endurance was the secret weapon. It let one boat prowl off Japan, then slide to Formosa, then cut north again without begging for fuel. Japan planned for raids, not a neighbor who moved in and stayed. Inside the boat, it smelled like coffee, oil, and damp canvas. Men slept in shifts over torpedoes and kept a calendar in grease pencil. Day 64, Day 70, Day 75. A machinist's mate checked the lube oil manifold and tapped the gauge with his knuckle like a church bell. The cook served eggs at 0200 after a night attack because hot food keeps hands steady. The sound man listened for the faint screw beat of a Maru convoy, his head against the bulkhead, breathing slow. That is how America fought a pressure war, no rest. No distance too far. The patrol log grew. Torpedo spreads, radical turns, silent running, then a long diesel charge under a black Pacific sky while the battery drank. The boat's soul was confidence. We can stay, we can choose, we can attack again tomorrow. That choice came from design and from a nation that built tenders, piers, and spare parts from Midway to Fremantle. Endurance turned every night into a new ambush, every dawn into a fresh hunt. Japan never believed a submarine could loiter in its backyard for months. The map said, home waters. The crew said, our beat. By the time the boat slid back into Pearl, paint was salt-burned, and the men were thinner, but the combat diary was thick. The truth is simple and huge. We engineered time on station, and time on station multiplied kills. A tiny force made the ocean feel American. Did you know a group under 2% of the Navy could strangle an empire's shipping? This is where the victory begins in the choice to stay. In early 1945, USS Barb SS 220, under Commander Eugene B. Lucky Flucky, surfaced off Hokkaido and unleashed a ripple of 5-inch spin-stabilized rockets into shore targets. A submarine, acting like a fast attack cruiser, punching the coast with sudden fire and then vanishing before the echoes died. It sounds like fiction. It was U.S. Navy innovation, bold, tested, and executed under a sky cold enough to bite. Rockets were not a stunt. They were a message. Endurance buys experiments that change an enemy's mind. Barb had the legs to stay, watch coastal traffic, chart rhythms, and try something nobody expected. Her crew drilled launch angles and fuse settings in cramped steel. The deck team moved like stagehands in a blackout. The warhead flashed, the shoreline shook. Then the boat slid under, silent and smug, while Japanese garrisons asked the wrong question: what ship did that? The answer was a wolf from under the waves. Flucky led with trust. We don't drive men on Barb. We lead them. Those words carried through the boat like a second heartbeat. When leadership feels like ownership, sailors do the impossible and call it Tuesday. Endurance made it routine to stalk for nights, to wait for moonless water, to time surfacing between patrol craft. When you live on an enemy's coast for weeks, you can choose perfect minutes. That is power. That is American flexibility turned into shock. Japan had strong sailors and skilled shipbuilders, but they never built a system that let submarines experiment at the edge and keep coming back to do it again. Barb's rockets were not the whole war, they were a signpost pointing to a larger truth. Our boats could stay long enough to learn, iterate, and strike smarter the next night. If rockets from a submarine sound wild, wait for what came next. A submarine crew would leave its boat, step onto home soil, or blow a train off the tracks. In July 1945, Barb's landing party paddled ashore at night, crawled through weeds and gravel, and wired a demolition under the track. The plan was simple and viciously precise. Wait for the headlamp, count the cars, touch off the charge, and run. The blast ripped into the darkness, and a train leapt off the line. It was the only US ground action on the Japanese home islands, and it was done by a submarine crew. Here is the question that scared planners in Tokyo. How do you defend a railroad from a submarine? Convoys can add escorts. Ports can put up nets. But rails? The patrol that launched rockets could also sabotage a timetable. That attack did more than bend steel. It broke a mental wall. It said nowhere is safe, not piers, not coastal roads, not even a night train on home soil. That is what endurance creates. 100 quiet chances to find the one hole no enemy expects. A seaman's hands shook as he tied off the last knot on the explosives. He was 20. He breathed in creosote and sea salt and thought about breakfast back on the boat. I thought we were sailors, he said to a shipmate later, still blinking at the memory. On Barb, sailors were raiders because their skipper trusted them. Trust turned fear into a clean job. The boat took them back aboard and slid into black water like a stage door closing. Japan's shock was total. Shore sentries and station masters began to see submarines in every shadow. A Navy tool had reached into civil life and pulled the plug on normal. This was strategic pressure, with a human face, men with wet boots, making a war feel personal. One small unit, one impossible raid. In a summer when Japan had fewer ships, fewer tankers, and fewer answers. The bridge to what comes next is numbers that feel unreal. The smallest arm of the Navy had the largest results. American submarines accounted for about 55% of Japanese merchant shipping, sunk roughly 1,300 ships, and around 5.3 million tons. That is a nation's bloodstream drained by a handful of boats that could stay on station for 2 months at a stretch. Admiral Chester W. Nimitz said it plain, "We shall never forget that it was our submarines that held the lines, while our fleets replaced losses and repaired wounds. The silent service stayed when others had to heal. Listen to the voices." Eugene B. Fluckey told his crew, "We don't drive men, we lead them." Richard H. O'Kane warned young officers, "A serious mistake is to base your tactics on your enemy's intentions unless you can counter them." And from a captured merchant sailor who survived a sinking and later spoke in halting English, "We never knew where your submarines slept." Those lines map the war: leadership, initiative, and fear in the enemy's gut. The boats did not just kill ships, they killed predictability. The math is brutal and honest. 52 U.S. submarines were lost. About 3,500 men never came home. The highest casualty rate in the Navy belonged to this small tribe. They knew the odds and went anyway. Because endurance changes, odds time stretches, chances multiply, and a crew that can wait can choose when to strike. That is how under 2% of a navy can move a whole war's ledger. Japan's shock deepened as factories starved. Oil from the south dwindled. Ore stalled. By late 1944, convoys were prayers strung across black water. Escorts fought hard, but radar, sonar skill, and night surface attacks kept American boats inside their decision loop. A final truth hangs in the air like the taste of cordite. After a salvo, small force, massive outcome. Now, look beyond the attacks and hear the machine behind them. The design, the tenders, the forward bases that made 75 days not a boast, but a plan. Designers put fuel in outer tanks, cold storage deep amidships, and gave crews air conditioning to protect mines and electronics in hot seas. A fleet boat could range about 11,000 nautical miles at 10 knots and carry enough food to keep men sharp for 2.5 months. Refrigeration meant meat on day 60, not just cans. Radar sets SJ surface search, SD air search lets skippers hunt and hide. The boat was a moving outpost of American industry. Logistics made it sing. Forward bases at Midway, Brisbane, Fremantle, and later Guam turned repairs that might take weeks at a stateside yard into days. Submarine tenders like USS Fulton and USS Bushnell were floating factories with machine shops, foundries, and spare torpedoes stacked like loaves. A skipper could limp in shot up and sail out lethal 48 hours later. That tempo is why 75-day patrols felt normal by 1944. It wasn't luck. It was a supply chain that reached across the ocean and never ran dry. Men felt that strength. A chief engineman wiped sweat with a rag that smelled like solvent and laughed. "Give me a day and a parts bin, and I'll hand you back a wolf." The wolf went hunting that night. Confidence fed courage, and courage turned into tactics. Night surface attacks at high speed, end-around maneuvers to gain the track, radar plotters drawing the party line in grease pencil. The boat lived off American planning. The crew lived off American trust. Japan fought hard and well. But it never built this web. Convoy doctrine came late. Air cover was thin. Radar sets lagged. Each fix arrived after our boats had already shifted again. That is how endurance becomes dominance. You stay long enough to learn faster than your enemy can adapt. The next step is the shock that breaks pride, the idea that even the largest warships could die to a handful of torpedoes launched from the dark. On the 29th of November 1944, USS Archerfish, SS 311, shadowed the massive carrier Shinano and fired a spread that tore into her side. Hours later, the pride of a navy rolled and sank. Carriers, cruisers, auxiliaries, submarines proved they could kill not only lifelines of commerce, the sword hand itself, that is a holy shit fact, with a steel echo. Here's the question that ends arguments. How did a tiny force deliver such outsized results? The answer is endurance matched with brains and nerve. Men like O'Kane drove USS Tang like a prize fighter on the surface at night. Radar up, attacking first. Crews drilled reloads in seconds, checked gyros twice, and treated sonar pings like a metronome of life. Under the hull, batteries hummed. Above the deck, the 5-inch gun waited to finish cripples. This was craft and courage, repeated for 60, 70, 75 days. The shock to Japan was strategic and moral. One by one, tankers vanished. Then big ships died. Then crews started to believe the ocean itself had changed sides, even when a boat was lost and 52 where the attack did not stop. Another wolf was already on station because the system sent her there. That is the American difference. We matched bold people with a machine that never slept. Now end on the hardest truth and the proudest one. About 3,500 submariners gave everything. They carried the highest loss rate in the Navy and still kept sailing. They did it with design that let them stay, with logistics that put them back fast, and with leaders who said, "We lead them," and meant it. Japan never knew we could live at sea that long without resupply. By the time they learned, the sea belonged to us. On the 19th of June 1944, USS Albacore stalked and torpedoed the new carrier Taiho during the Battle of the Philippine Sea. Flames chewed her decks until she blew apart. That same day, USS Kavala punched into the screen and sank the veteran carrier Shokaku. 5 months later, the 29th of November 1944, USS Archerfish shadowed the mammoth Shinano through the night and fired the spread that doomed the largest carrier ever to sail. These kills were not lucky shots. They were the payoff of weeks at sea, fuel enough to wait, and radar that let American skippers choose the moment. Crews worked like clockwork in heat and sweat. The SJ radar scope glowed. Plots took shape in grease pencil. The captain's voice was low and clipped. Torpedo rooms went quiet except for the click-thud of gyros and door dogs. When metal slammed home, the boat felt it in its bones. "Fire," said a voice that never needed to shout. Bubbles, then the long count. Warheads struck, and steel screamed. That is how an empire learns its pride can drown. Japan's shock was strategic. If carriers cannot sortie, the ocean shrinks. Escorts multiplied, zigzag patterns tightened, but American boats stayed for days, then weeks, then months, turning vigilance into ambush. Submarines did not just starve tankers, they broke sword hands. They made admirals fear the dark between waves. That is the real terror of endurance. It turns every hour into a chance to erase a capital ship. Captain Dudley Mush Morton of USS Wahoo had once told his men, "Wahoo is expendable." That hard truth ran through the silent service like current. Chief after chief taught kids to move faster, think cleaner, and trust steel. The result was simple and devastating. The biggest ships were targets, not talismans. Carriers burned, cruisers vanished. An empire's high notes ended in bubbles. We could stay long enough to finish the job, then pivot to the next hunt, and there was always a next hunt. By late 1944, Japan's oil trickled in thorns, not rivers. Tankers vanished on black water. Ore slowed, food ran thin. Sailors counted drums on piers and felt the war closing like a fist. American boats made that happen by living on convoy routes for 60, 70, 75 days, working end-arounds and midnight surface attacks until nerves cracked. You can hear the pattern in a sonar room, a faint beat, a correction. The quartermaster marks a plot. Course 090, speed 9 knots, convoy of 4, 2 escorts. SJ radar shows range opening. The skipper changes plan. He wants the tankers, not the freighters. "We stay on them," he says. The diesels rumble, then fall silent as the boat slides under. Hours stretch, then the shot opens. A ripple of torpedoes moves out like a fist through silk. Cargoes meant for blast furnaces never arrive. Refineries go hungry. Assembly lines blink. It is simple math. Take away fuel, and even brave pilots are just men with empty tanks. The system behind the punch mattered. Forward bases at Midway, Brisbane, Fremantle and Guam turned battle damage into fresh patrols. Tenders were floating cities, machine shops, foundries, torpedo magazines. You could swap a busted Fairbanks Morse 388-1 divided by 8 engine component and sail in 2 days. That tempo kept boats on station while planners in Tokyo guessed at ghosts. The lesson is harsh and beautiful. Logistics wins wars you never see. A Japanese merchant sailor pulled from the sea, stared at an American mug of hot coffee and said, "We never knew where your submarines slept." That sentence is the epitaph for a shipping empire. There were brave escorts and clever helmsmen. They could not outrun a nation that engineered endurance and trained men to use it like a knife. Convoys thinned, harbours quieted. The map of Japan's supply lines turned pale. When the tankers die, the factories whisper. When factories whisper, armies grow still. That is what our boats did, one patrol at a time. On the 7th of February 1943, after a savage surface fight, USS Growler lay wounded and exposed. A Japanese gun crew raked the bridge. Commanding Officer Howard W. Gilmore, already hit, saw the next burst coming. He gave his last order, "Take her down." Growler dove. The captain stayed on the bridge and died to save his men. That choice still teaches midshipmen what command means. Here's the question no enemy could answer. How do you beat a force that can wait you out and still choose to fight closer, harder, and smarter? The answer was a trio: design, training, and culture. Design gave range, stores, air conditioning that kept people sharp after week 8. Training drilled radar plots, torpedo checks, and reloads until seconds mattered. Culture told skippers to think, not tremble. Gilmore's sacrifice sat beside tactics by men like Richard O'Kane, who drove USS Tang like a boxer, using night and speed as weapons. Together they made a truth. When you can stay, you can pick the right minute and change a battle with a single word. The crew's voices run through the years. "Take her down" is carved in stone, but so is a machinist's whisper. He bought our breath. A torpedo man remembers the clang of the muzzle door and the feeling that the boat itself had a soul now. That is the human core inside the math of endurance. You can fuel a hull. You must also feed a heart. America did both. Japan respected courage. They saw Growler vanish and knew the fight would not soften. Escorts tightened circles. Depth charges fell in angry ladders. Our boats kept coming. They could, because the system behind them never slept, and because leaders taught sailors to choose duty over fear. The bridge to the finish is built on choices like Gilmore's: brutal, clean, and American. The end game is numbers that bend belief, their names read like a litany: Wahoo, Tang, Harder, Grunion, Amberjack, Trigger, and more. About 3,500 submariners still lie at sea. The silent service carried the highest casualty rate in the U.S. Navy. And still the patrols sailed because endurance without courage is just a long trip. Endurance with courage is a weapon. Look at USS Harder under Commander Sam Dealey in 1944. In 5 days, Harder sank 5 Japanese destroyers near Tawi, tearing holes in the escort screens that guarded a fleet. That is not a rumor. That is what aggression looks like when married to radar, discipline, and the grit to attack again after the last depth charge stops echoing. Sailors who had eaten the same canned peaches for 60 days still hustled cartridges to the 5-inch gun and grinned through cordite smoke. "We can take another," a loader said. He meant a target and a hit. There was mercy in the machine, too. Survivors were pulled from oil-slick water when it was possible and safe. Medical kits and blankets came out fast. A Japanese seaman, coughing salt, stared in dazed surprise at an American corpsman who said, "You're okay now." That moment matters. Strength without cruelty is hard power squared. It breaks an enemy's story about you. It also keeps your own people human across months of danger. Japan's officers were no cowards. They fought until hulls split. But by 1945, the pattern was set. Tankers were rare. Escorts were green. Radar and sonar made the dark bright for us and stayed dark for them. 52 boats paid the ultimate price, and yet the fleet never ran short of patrols, because shipyards, tenders, and training pipelines filled the line. That is what a free nation can do when it points industry at a purpose and trusts its people. The scale of the result is coming numbers that sound impossible until you see them in ink. Submariners made up under 2% of the Navy, yet they sank over half of Japan's merchant ships. Lost in the war, about 1,000. 300 vessels, and roughly 5.3 million tons. They also helped send major warships down, carriers like Tai-Ho and Shokaku, the battleship Congo, and heavy cruisers that once ruled sea lanes. When admirals counted what remained, they saw gaps no plan could bridge. The ocean had changed sides. The factory power behind those patrols was stunning. American yards turned out Gato and Balau-class hulls at a drumbeat pace. Diesel manufacturers shipped components by the trainload. Submarine tenders sailed with machine shops and foundries aboard. Training commands produced sonar operators who could read a screw beat like a fingerprint. This is what happens when a democracy scales skill. People who grew up fixing tractors learned to fix turbines and plotting boards. The learning curve bent in our favor and stayed there. Quotes carry the weight. Admiral Chester W. Nimitz said, "We shall never forget that it was our submarines that held the lines." Eugene Fluckey told his men, "We lead them." A Japanese prisoner whispered, "We never knew where your submarines slept." 3 lines, 1 truth: endurance, leadership, and fear in the enemy's mind. Every patrol extended that truth another 100 miles. Japan tried to answer. Convoys grew, zigzags tightened, and new destroyers joined screens. But the math never flipped. With fuel short, training time shrank. With ships gone, options died. Our boats stayed, learned, and hit harder. In the end, the numbers sit on the page like iron. A tiny arm produced the largest strategic shift in the Pacific. Now take that iron and turn it into a single sentence that explains victory in a way a child can feel and a scholar can prove. We shall never forget that it was our submarines that held the lines against the enemy, while our fleets replaced losses and repaired wounds. Admiral Chester W. Nimitz said that after counting the cost and the gain, it is not poetry, it is accounting. Less than 2% of the Navy strangled an empire's lifelines, while carriers rearmed and armies formed. They did it by staying at sea for about 75 days without resupply, by trusting radar and training, and by believing that one more night on station could change history. Here's the last question. Why could America do this when others could not? The answer is values turned into systems. We designed boats for long legs. We built global logistics with forward bases and tenders that erased distance. We trained people to think, not freeze. Leaders like Fluckey and O'Kane made risk a tool, not a threat. Sailors like Gilmore chose duty over breath. Industry, ingenuity, and grit met on steel decks and shook an empire apart. The human notes make the numbers sing. Take her down as the cost of saving a crew. We lead them as the promise that pulled kids through fear. We never knew where your submarines slept, as the enemy's admission that the map no longer belonged to them. Add the iron math. About 1,300 ships sunk, some 5.3 million tons erased, capital ships drowned, and a merchant fleet broken beyond repair. Then add the names of the 52 boats that did not return. It is victory and sorrow in equal measure. This is America at full stride, bold ideas, careful hands, and a moral spine. We did not just win with steel, we won with patience, We won by staying. We won because a free people can build a machine that trusts its operators and a culture that trusts its leaders. Japan never knew we could live off their coast for months without a lifeline. By the time they learned, the ocean itself spoke with an American voice.